The morning air felt crisp against Lee's face as he adjusted his backpack straps and checked his compass one last time. After 15 years of hiking through national forests across the country, he had developed a sixth sense for navigation. But today something felt different in Blackwater National Forest. The usual landmarks seemed altered, as if the forest itself had shifted overnight. Lee had planned this solo expedition for months. As a wildlife photographer with a growing online following, he was always searching for untouched corners of wilderness to capture. The unmapped section of Blackwater had been calling to him ever since he'd heard rumors of unusual formations deep within its boundaries. Just 3 days of solitude, he mumbled to himself, tightening the laces on his worn hiking boots. His dog-eared trail map indicated a series of small lakes about 7 miles in, perfect for camping and maybe catching the sunset over water. That was the plan, at least. By midday, dark clouds had gathered overhead, unusual for this time of year. The wind picked up, bending the tops of pine trees and sending dead leaves swirling around Lee's boots. He pulled his jacket tighter and pressed forward, hoping to reach higher ground before the weather turned. The storm hit with unexpected fury. Rain poured down in sheets, transforming the forest floor into slippery mud. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the darkened woods in brief electric flashes. Lee took shelter under a rocky overhang, watching as small streams formed where dry earth had been just minutes before. So much for the weather report, he sighed, digging through his pack for his emergency radio. The static told him all he needed to know. No reception this deep in the woods. He'd have to wait it out. 3 hours later, the storm finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Fallen branches blocked familiar paths, and newly formed streams cut across what had been dry trails. Lee checked his compass again, frowning at the reading. Something wasn't right. The needle swung erratically as if confused by its surroundings. Great. Just great. With the sun beginning its descent, Lee made a judgment call. He'd head east toward higher ground, hoping to spot a landmark or get cell reception. The forest grew denser as he hiked, the undergrowth more tangled, as if fewer people had passed this way. Pushing through a particularly thick section of brush, his boots suddenly splashed in ankle-deep water. What the... The ground had become marshy, suggesting a lake or large pond nearby. Not ideal for camping, but maybe he could circle around and find drier ground. Lee adjusted his course slightly, following the gradual slope upward. The trees thinned as he climbed, offering brief glimpses of sky between branches. After another hour of difficult hiking, Lee's shoulders ached from carrying his gear through such challenging terrain. Just as he considered finding a spot to make camp for the night, the forest opened up into a wide clearing. Lee stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth falling open. There, nestled among towering pines and surrounded by what appeared to be an old lake bed, sat a massive cruise ship. Impossible, Lee whispered, rubbing his eyes as if he might be hallucinating from exhaustion. But the ship remained, its white hull stained with years of exposure, windows broken or clouded with grime. Vegetation crawled up its sides, nature slowly reclaiming the massive vessel. The ship's name, partially visible through rust and moss, read Pacific Dreamer. Lee fumbled for his camera, his hands shaking slightly as he removed the lens cap. Through the viewfinder, the surreal scene became somehow more real. A cruise ship, easily several hundred feet long, sitting in a forest clearing miles from any ocean or navigable river. "How did you get here?" he murmured, snapping photo after photo as the evening light cast long shadows across the abandoned vessel. Common sense told Lee to mark the location and head back to civilization immediately. This was the kind of discovery that would make headlines. But with darkness approaching and no clear trail back, he'd have to wait until morning. Lee found a small dry area at the forest's edge with a clear view of the ship. As he set up his tent, questions raced through his mind. Had the ship been transported here piece by piece for some eccentric millionaire's project? Was this area once underwater, a massive lake that had dried up? Neither explanation seemed plausible. After securing his camp, Lee sat on a fallen log and opened his journal, sketching the scene before him while details remained fresh. The ship looked like it had been there for decades. Trees grew close to its hull, some appearing to be 30 or 40 years old. This wasn't a recent placement. As twilight deepened into night, Lee noticed something else. The forest had gone completely silent. No chirping insects, no rustling nocturnal animals, no distant owl calls. Just silence. as if the wildlife avoided this particular clearing. Sleep came fitfully that night. Lee's dreams filled with images of water rising around his tent, lifting him up to the level of the ship's rusted railings. Phantom passengers waving from behind grimy portholes. He woke several times, heart racing, only to see the dark silhouette of the Pacific Dreamer outlined against the star-filled sky. Morning brought fog that swirled around the ship, making it appear as if it were floating on a cloud sea. Lee boiled water for coffee on his portable stove, never taking his eyes off the vessel. In daylight, he could better make out details: a swimming pool on the top deck, lounge chairs scattered about, a gangplank that now led straight into dirt instead of water. After breakfast, Lee packed a day bag with essentials: water, energy bars, first aid kit, flashlight, and most importantly, his camera equipment. He hesitated before approaching the ship. Something about it felt wrong, as if it shouldn't exist here in this forest clearing. But curiosity won out over caution. The ground surrounding the ship showed signs of once being underwater: smooth stones, unusual erosion patterns, even the occasional sun-bleached mussel shell. As Lee approached the massive hull, he noted how the forest had begun to incorporate the ship into its ecosystem. Vines crawled up anchor chains. Small trees grew through cracks in the lower deck. Birds had nested in broken windows. The gangplank had collapsed years ago, but nature had provided an alternative entrance. A large tree had fallen against the side of the ship, creating a natural ramp to what appeared to be a service entrance on the second deck. Lee tested the trunk with his weight before committing to the climb. Don't do anything stupid, he reminded himself, carefully making his way up the fallen tree. The service door hung partially open, its hinges frozen with rust. Lee squeezed through the gap, flashlight in hand, and found himself in a narrow corridor. Emergency exit signs hung at odd angles, their glow-in-the-dark paint still faintly visible. The air inside smelled of mildew and decay, but underneath lurked something else, a faint chemical odor he couldn't quite identify. Lee's footsteps echoed as he made his way deeper into the ship. Sunlight filtered through broken windows and holes in the ceiling, creating eerie light patterns on the walls. Everywhere were signs of a hasty departure: overturned furniture, personal items scattered across floors, cabinet doors left hanging open. In what appeared to be a dining room, tables remained set for a meal never served. Tarnished silverware lay beside china plates, now hosting colonies of moss rather than food. A large chandelier had crashed to the floor, crystal pieces scattered like diamonds across rotting carpet. Lee photographed everything methodically, part of him already thinking about the documentary this could become. Another part remained uneasy, sensing that whatever had caused the Pacific Dreamer to be abandoned so completely must have been serious. A calendar still hung in the purser's office, its pages yellowed with age. The month displayed was June 1989, with several dates circled in red. Lee photographed it, making mental notes to research what might have happened that summer. As afternoon approached, Lee decided to explore one more area before heading back to camp: the bridge. Navigating the ship's maze-like corridors took time, especially with some stairwells collapsed or blocked by debris. When he finally reached the bridge, the scene was much like the rest of the ship, abandoned in haste. Charts remained spread across tables, logbooks lay open, coffee mugs sat with decades-old residue at the bottom. But something caught Lee's eye: modifications to the ship that seemed out of place for a luxury cruise liner. Heavy equipment had been bolted to certain sections of the bridge. Strange gauges with no clear purpose were integrated into control panels, and most puzzling, a series of maps that showed not ocean routes, but what appeared to be lake formations with depth measurements. As Lee leaned in to photograph these anomalies, a sound froze him in place. Metal groaning somewhere deep in the ship, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Logic told him it was just the structure settling or an animal that had made its home aboard. But a primal part of his brain screamed that he wasn't alone. Lee quickly gathered his gear and made his way back toward the exit, moving as quietly as possible while listening for any other sounds. The ship remained silent except for the occasional creak of metal expanding in the afternoon heat. Back at his campsite, Lee reviewed his photos, already planning his return to civilization. Whatever the Pacific Dreamer's story was, he intended to uncover it. How a massive cruise ship ended up abandoned in the middle of a forest was a mystery too compelling to ignore. As the sun set on his first day, Lee woke before dawn, his dreams filled with rusted corridors and empty staterooms. The silhouette of the Pacific Dreamer stood out against the lightening sky, a dark monument to some forgotten disaster. After a quick breakfast, he packed his gear methodically, leaving his tent and heavy equipment at the campsite. Today would be dedicated to a proper exploration. Focus on the facts, he reminded himself, checking his camera batteries and extra memory cards. Whatever happened here needed documenting properly. Morning dew had made the fallen tree slippery, so Lee took his time climbing up to the service entrance. In daylight, the ship looked even more out of place, a massive steel giant surrounded by trees that had grown tall in its shadow. Based on the vegetation climbing its hull, the Pacific Dreamer had been stranded here for decades. This time, Lee entered with a plan. He'd start at the top deck and work his way down systematically, documenting everything. The upper deck greeted him with an apocalyptic swimming pool, cracked concrete filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. Lounge chairs lay scattered like forgotten toys, their once white fabric now a moldy green. "Hello?" Lee called out, more to dispel the eerie silence than expecting an answer. His voice echoed across the empty deck, startling a family of birds that had nested in the ship's single smokestack. The ship's main stairwell remained largely intact, allowing easier access between decks. Lee descended to the promenade level, where shops and entertainment areas once bustled with passengers. Nature had reclaimed these spaces completely. Moss carpeted the casino floor, vines crept in through broken windows, and small trees grew through cracks in the flooring. In what once had been the ship's boutique, mannequins stood in eerie poses, their plastic skin discolored by time and weather. One had toppled over, its head separated and lying several feet away, staring blankly at the ceiling. Lee photographed the scene, trying to ignore the chill creeping up his spine. "Just plastic," he muttered, moving on quickly. The ship's grand ballroom offered a stunning sight, a once magnificent space with a collapsed ceiling that now allowed sunlight to stream in, creating a natural greenhouse. Plants flourished in this unexpected environment, with flowers blooming among fallen chandeliers. Lee spent nearly an hour photographing this strange marriage of human architecture and nature's reclamation. As midday approached, Lee discovered the ship's galley. Unlike other areas, the kitchen showed signs of deliberate abandonment. Cabinets stood empty, utensils and equipment removed. Only the largest appliances remained, now rusted beyond recognition. But strangely, a clipboard still hung by the entrance, its pages protected from the worst of the elements by a plastic cover. Lee carefully removed the top sheet. A duty roster dated June 15, 1989. 27 crew members were listed for kitchen duty that day. What had happened to them? Where had they gone? And why leave so suddenly that personal items remained throughout the ship? Deeper into the vessel, Lee found the crew quarters. These small rooms told the most human stories. Abandoned photographs, clothing left in drawers, personal letters now illegible from moisture damage. In one room, a collection of cassette tapes sat neatly organized on a shelf, their labels faded but still showing names of bands popular in the late 1980s. "Someone loved their music," Lee said softly, carefully opening a journal he found beneath the small bed. Most pages had fused together with moisture, but one entry remained partially readable. Day 108 of lake testing. "Captain says we'll need to extend again. Some of the crew are getting restless about the changes to the rest had been destroyed by water damage." Lee photographed the journal page, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. This confirmed his suspicion that the ship had been part of some kind of lake operation, not an ocean liner that had mysteriously ended up inland. By mid-afternoon, Lee had reached the passenger cabins. Unlike the crew quarters, many of these rooms showed signs of hasty packing. Empty drawers pulled out, closet doors left ajar. But like elsewhere on the ship, some personal items remained. A child's stuffed bear sat forgotten on a narrow bed. A pair of reading glasses rested on a nightstand. A half-finished letter on hotel stationery described the most unusual cruise experience before trailing off mid-sentence. As Lee moved deeper into the passenger section, he noticed something odd. Certain cabins had been modified. Extra equipment had been installed on walls, strange meters and dials now frozen with rust. One room had been converted entirely into what looked like a small laboratory, with mounting brackets for equipment long since removed. What were they doing out here? Lee wondered aloud, photographing these modifications carefully. The ship's hospital wing showed the most disturbing changes. Additional beds had been installed, well beyond what a normal cruise would require. Storage cabinets labeled specimens lined one wall, and most concerning, heavy locks had been added to some doors, now hanging broken from their hinges. Lee's unease grew as he discovered more modifications throughout the ship. The Pacific Dreamer had clearly been repurposed for something beyond a pleasure cruise. The question was what, and why here in the middle of what must have once been a lake now reclaimed by forest? The lowest accessible deck contained the ship's engines and mechanical rooms. Lee navigated carefully through these spaces, aware that structural damage could be more severe this deep in the vessel. The massive engines sat silent, thick with rust but still impressive in their scale. Beyond the engine room, Lee discovered a section of the ship that didn't match any cruise liner blueprint he'd ever seen. Heavy doors, now forced open by years of exposure, led to what appeared to be research laboratories. Mounting brackets for equipment remained bolted to floors and walls, though whatever they once held had been removed. One room contained large, empty tanks like massive aquariums with heavy glass now cracked and clouded. Faded labels indicated depth measurements and something called pressure testing. Another room held what appeared to be monitoring equipment, designed to track something in the surrounding water. They weren't just cruising, Lee realized, photographing everything methodically. They were studying something. As Lee explored this mysterious section, his boot kicked something across the floor, a plastic identification badge. He picked it up, wiping away grime to reveal a logo he didn't recognize. A stylized wave with the letters DLR underneath. The name and photo had degraded beyond recognition, but the title remained visible. Research Division Lake Project. The final room Lee discovered nearly made him drop his camera. Unlike the other laboratories, this one still contained equipment, massive machinery bolted to the floor and connected to what looked like drilling apparatus. Maps covered one wall, showing the lake bed with markers indicating sample sites. And, most disturbing, a large warning sign, partially visible through years of grime. Contamination Protocol Zone. A chill ran through Lee's body despite the afternoon heat. Whatever research had been conducted here had involved potentially hazardous materials. Had there been an accident? Was that why the ship was abandoned so completely? As these questions raced through Lee's mind, a sound from above made him freeze. The unmistakable noise of something heavy falling, followed by footsteps. After hours believing himself alone on this ghost ship, the sound was jarring. "Hello?" Lee called out, his voice echoing through the metal corridors. No response came. Common sense told Lee to leave immediately. The ship was structurally unsound and parts could be collapsing. Or wildlife, a deer or bear perhaps, might have wandered aboard. But a more primitive part of his brain whispered other possibilities. What if someone else was exploring? Or worse, what if someone had been here all along? With daylight fading and his flashlight batteries limited, Lee decided to head back to camp. He'd gathered enough evidence for one day. Tomorrow he would return to civilization and begin researching what the Pacific Dreamer had been doing in this lake, and why it had been abandoned so completely. As Lee climbed carefully down the fallen tree trunk that served as his exit route, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Turning to look back at the ship, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A faint light glowing in one of the upper deck windows, visible for just a moment before blinking out. Back at his campsite, Lee reviewed his findings, organizing photos and notes while occasionally glancing at the darkening silhouette of the ship. Whatever secrets the Pacific Dreamer held, they were bigger and potentially more dangerous than he'd initially thought. This wasn't just an abandoned cruise ship. It was the remnant of something deliberately hidden, a mystery that someone might want to keep buried in these woods. Morning fog clung to the trees as Lee packed his camping gear. He cast one last look at the Pacific Dreamer, taking several final photographs as evidence of his discovery. The strange light he'd seen in the window last night hadn't reappeared, but sleep had come fitfully, interrupted by every creak and rustle from the surrounding forest. "Time to find some answers," he muttered, shouldering his heavy backpack. Finding his way out of the forest proved easier than the journey in. The storm had passed, his compass worked normally again, and within 5 hours of hiking, Lee spotted the gravel parking lot where he'd left his truck 3 days ago. The drive back to civilization gave him time to process everything he'd seen. The ship itself was extraordinary enough, a massive cruise liner stranded in a forest. But the modifications, the research equipment, the warning signs about contamination, those suggested something far more complex than an abandoned pleasure cruise. The small town of Pinewood sat on the edge of Blackwater National Forest. Lee had passed through on his way to the trailhead, noting its single main street lined with the usual rural businesses: a diner, a hardware store, a small grocery. Now he pulled into the town with new purpose. If anyone knew the history of a massive ship in their forest, it would be the locals. The Bell and Whistle Diner seemed the obvious place to start. Small-town diners were information hubs, and the lunch crowd would be full of longtime residents. Lee grabbed his notebook and a folder of printed photos, leaving his larger equipment locked in the truck. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door. The lunch rush had just begun, with about half the tables occupied by workers in various uniforms and a few elderly people who looked like they might spend most days here. Lee took a seat at the counter, ordering coffee and a sandwich from a middle-aged woman whose name tag read, Flo. "Passing through?" Flo asked, placing a steaming mug in front of him. "Sort of. I'm actually researching something unusual I found in the forest." Lee kept his voice casual, but the words had an immediate effect. Two older men at the end of the counter exchanged glances. "What kind of unusual?" Flo asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew. Lee pulled out a photograph of the Pacific Dreamer. "This kind of unusual. A cruise ship miles from any water." The diner grew noticeably quieter. Flo's smile tightened as she glanced at the photo. "Where exactly did you say you found this?" "About 7 miles into Blackwater. Eastern section." Lee watched their reactions carefully. "I'm guessing it's not a secret around here?" One of the older men at the counter snorted. "Not a secret exactly. More like something folks don't talk about much." "How come?" Lee asked. "Bad memories," the man replied, sliding over to the empty stool beside Lee. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of outdoor work. "The name's Hank. I worked construction on the dam project back in '78. "Dam project?" Hank nodded. "Whole area used to be the Blackwater Valley. Government approved a massive hydroelectric project, flooded the entire valley, created Lake Blackwater, about 40 square miles of water where that forest now stands." Lee's eyes widened. "So the ship was part of a lake resort?" "Bingo." Hank took a sip of coffee. "Some big company from the city bought in once the lake was filled. Built docks, a resort hotel on the shore, and brought in that floating monstrosity as the centerpiece. Called it the Inland Cruise Experience or some such nonsense." "What happened?" Flo placed Lee's sandwich in front of him. "The dam happened. Or didn't happen, I should say." Hank nodded. "Whole project was rushed, corners cut. 3 years after completion, engineers found structural problems. Big ones. They had to gradually release the water to prevent a catastrophic failure. Lake Blackwater became a mud pit, then eventually forest again." "And they just left the ship there?" Lee asked incredulously. "Too expensive to move," Flo said. "Company went bankrupt trying to sue the dam builders. Nobody wanted to pay millions to dismantle and remove a ship from a dried-up lake bed in the middle of nowhere." This explained the ship's presence, but not the research equipment, or the warning signs about contamination. Lee pulled out another photo, this one showing the laboratory section with the strange equipment. "Any idea what this was about?" he asked. Hank and Flo exchanged looks again, but this time it was the other elderly man at the counter who spoke up. "If you're going to dig into this, you should talk to Rosie Walsh. She worked on that ship. Right until the end." "Rosie still talks about that?" Flo asked, sounding surprised. "Not willingly," the man replied, "but she's the only one left who knows what really happened those last few weeks." Lee got directions to Rosie's house, a small blue bungalow on the outskirts of town. He finished his lunch, paid, and thanked everyone for the information, aware that several patrons were watching him with curious or concerned expressions. Rosie's house looked well kept, with flower boxes in the windows and bird feeders hanging from a large oak tree in the yard. Lee approached uncertainly, wondering how to explain his presence without sounding like a lunatic. After knocking, he waited nearly a minute before the door opened slightly, held by a security chain. A woman in her 70s peered out, her silver hair cut in a practical bob, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked. Lee introduced himself and explained his discovery in the forest. I was told you might know something about the Pacific Dreamer. You worked there? The woman's expression hardened. Who told you that? Some folks at the Bell and Whistle. I'm just trying to understand what happened there. Rosie studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I don't talk about that ship. There's nothing good to remember. She began to close the door, but Lee quickly held up the photo of the laboratory section. Please, I found some strange equipment on board. Warning signs about contamination. I just want to know if there's any danger. The mention of contamination changed something in Rosie's expression. She closed the door, unhooked the chain, and opened it wider. You'd better come in. Rosie's living room was neat and modest, with furniture at least 30 years old but well-maintained. Photos of what appeared to be children and grandchildren lined the walls. She offered Lee tea, which he accepted out of politeness rather than thirst. I was the head of housekeeping on the Pacific Dreamer, Rosie explained once they were seated. Started when it was still a normal cruise ship. Good job, decent pay. When did things change? Lee asked. Rosie's hands tightened around her teacup. About 2 years in. The cruise business wasn't making enough money. Lake Blackwater was impressive enough, but not many people wanted to cruise on a lake when real ocean cruises weren't much more expensive. She took a sip of tea, her eyes distant with memory. The company was going under. Then suddenly they had money again. New investors, management said. That's when the research division moved in and took over the lower decks. That's when everything changed. What kind of research? Lee asked gently. They said environmental studies at first. Water quality, lake ecosystem, that sort of thing. But then they started bringing in heavy equipment. Drilling into the lake bed. Taking core samples. The scientists stopped talking to the regular crew. Security was added. Lee showed her more photos, the modified cabins, the warning signs, the strange tanks. Rosie nodded sadly at each one. They were looking for something in the lake bed. Something they thought was valuable enough to convert a cruise ship into a research vessel. She set down her cup with a shaky hand. But they found something else instead. What? Lee asked, leaning forward. Contamination. From an old factory that operated in the valley before it was flooded. Chemicals that had seeped deep into the ground. When they drilled into the lake bed, they released it into the water. Rosie's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. People started getting sick. Passengers, crew. Skin rashes at first, then worse. The company tried to keep it quiet. Said it was just a stomach bug going around. But I saw the medical reports. I cleaned the officers' quarters. She stood abruptly, walking to an old secretary desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she removed a faded folder and handed it to Lee. I took these the day they evacuated us. Nobody else seemed interested in the truth. Inside were photocopies of internal memos, medical reports, and test results, all bearing the same logo Lee had seen on the ID badge, DLR, Deep Lake Resources. The documents detailed increasing levels of toxic compounds in lake water samples and multiple cases of unexplained illness among passengers and crew. They cleared the ship overnight, Rosie continued. Said there was a problem with the dam, that the lake would be partially drained for repairs. Paid everyone 3 months' salary to keep quiet and sent us home. A week later, the draining began, but it wasn't for repairs. They were containing the contamination, Lee realized. Rosie nodded. By the time anyone asked questions, the lake was gone. The company had declared bankruptcy, and government officials were declaring the area off-limits due to environmental concerns. They never mentioned what those concerns actually were. But they just left everything there? The ship, the equipment, the chemicals. Cheaper than a proper cleanup, Rosie said bitterly. They put up fences, posted warnings, and let nature do the rest. Until recently, when budget cuts meant even the fences weren't maintained anymore. That's how you got in, I imagine. The small motel on the edge of Pinewood offered little in terms of comfort, but it had 2 things Lee desperately needed: a decent internet connection and privacy. He spread Rosie's documents across the bed, organizing them by date. The story they told was troubling. Deep Lake Resources had appeared seemingly out of nowhere in 1987, purchasing the struggling cruise operation. Their official business was natural resource, evaluation and extraction. But the documents suggested their real interest lay beneath the lake bed, core samples from an area rich in rare earth minerals, used in electronics manufacturing. What they hadn't counted on was the toxic legacy left behind by Westfield Chemical, a factory that had operated in the valley for decades before the dam project flooded everything. When DLR's drilling disturbed the sealed pockets of industrial waste, chemicals leached into the lake water. They knew, Lee muttered, reading an internal memo dated 2 months before the evacuation. They knew and kept operating anyway. The memo detailed rising contamination levels and recommended immediate suspension of drilling operations. A handwritten note in the margin simply read, "Denied, continue as scheduled." Time running out, Lee took photos of each document, creating digital backups before carefully returning the originals to the folder. His next steps needed to be thoughtful. A story this big, corporate negligence, environmental contamination, potential ongoing health risks, required solid evidence and the right platform. After sending a few emails to contacts in environmental journalism, Lee drove to the county records office. The clerk looked bored until Lee mentioned Lake Blackwater and the dam project. "That's all sealed," the clerk said immediately, then looked around as if worried someone had overheard. "Sealed? Why would historical records about a dam project be sealed?" The clerk leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Government order. All those records were moved to federal archives years ago. Something about national security implications. A failed dam in rural nowhere has national security implications?" Lee asked incredulously. The clerk just shrugged. "Above my pay grade, friend." Lee's next stop was the public library. The elderly librarian, her glasses hanging from a beaded chain, proved more helpful than the records clerk. "Oh, I remember when they built that dam," she said, leading Lee to the local history section. "Such excitement about the new lake. Tourism, recreation, better jobs. Then it all went wrong." She pulled down a bound collection of local newspapers from the late 1970s and early 1980s. "It's all in here. The groundbreaking, the flooding of the valley, the grand opening of the lake resort. And then..." She pulled down another volume. "The problems." Lee spent hours poring over the yellowed newspapers. The story unfolded in headlines. Lake Blackwater Resort opens with gala celebration. Cruise ship brings luxury to local tourism. Then later, dam shows signs of structural weakness. Lake to be partially drained for repairs. But after the draining announcement, coverage mysteriously stopped. No updates on repairs, no stories about the impact on local businesses, nothing about the abandoned cruise ship. It was as if Lake Blackwater had simply been erased from local consciousness. The last mention Lee found was a small article from 1990. Former lake bed declared restricted zone. Federal authorities have designated the former Lake Blackwater Basin as a restricted environmental recovery zone. Citing ongoing remediation efforts, officials state the area will remain closed to the public for the foreseeable future. As Lee was about to leave, the librarian handed him one more item, a thin file folder. "You might find this interesting. It's from our vertical file, things that didn't fit in the regular collection." Inside was a collection of letters to the editor and unpublished articles written by a local doctor, Doug Fletcher. The doctor had documented unusual health complaints among former resort workers and people who had vacationed at Lake Blackwater. Persistent rashes, respiratory issues, vision problems, all with no clear diagnosis. The final letter, dated 1991, was addressed to the newspaper's editor but apparently never published. "The pattern of illness is clear to anyone willing to see it. Something in that lake water has affected potentially hundreds of people, and no one will acknowledge it. The silence from officials is not just frustrating, it's criminal." A handwritten note on the bottom of the page added, "Sam, this will be my last submission on this matter. I've been advised by concerned parties that continued pursuit of this issue could jeopardize my medical license." They've won. Doug Lee photographed these documents as well, adding them to his growing file of evidence. The pieces were fitting together, painting a picture more disturbing than he'd initially imagined. Not just an abandoned ship, not just corporate negligence, but a coordinated effort to bury the truth about what happened at Lake Blackwater. Back at the motel, Lee's email notifications showed responses from 2 environmental journalists. Both expressed interest but wanted more concrete evidence. Water and soil samples, testimony from affected individuals, official documentation of the contamination. Lee stared at the ceiling, contemplating his next move. He needed to go back to the ship, to collect physical evidence of what had happened there. But now, understanding the potential danger, He couldn't go unprepared. The hardware store provided what he needed: a basic water testing kit, heavy-duty gloves, protective masks, and sample containers. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the purchases but didn't comment. As Lee loaded the supplies into his truck, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The driver seemed to be watching him, but when Lee looked directly at the vehicle, it pulled away smoothly. Getting paranoid, Lee muttered, though the hairs on his neck stood up. That feeling only intensified when he returned to his motel room and found it had been searched. The disturbance was subtle. His laptop moved slightly from where he'd left it, the bed covers too perfectly straightened, Rosie's folder not quite in the same position. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. Someone knew what he was doing. Lee's phone rang, startling him. The number was unlisted. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "You need to stop," a man's voice said without introduction. "Whatever you think you're investigating, it's better left alone." "Who is this?" "Someone who knows the consequences of digging into Lake Blackwater." "The ship, the contamination, all of it, it's contained. The situation is managed. Your interference risks public panic over a non-issue." "Non-issue?" Lee's temper flared. "People got sick. Some might still be sick. And someone's been watching me, searched my room." "A courtesy check," the voice interrupted smoothly. "We could have simply confiscated your materials. Consider this a professional warning. There are no Pulitzers in this story, only headaches. For everyone." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lee staring at his phone. The threat only strengthened his resolve. Whatever happened at Lake Blackwater was important enough for someone to still be protecting it decades later. Lee quickly packed his belongings, including Rosie's documents, and checked out of the motel. He wasn't running away, he was changing strategies. If someone was watching him in town, he needed to move quickly and quietly. He drove to a different town 30 miles away, checked into another motel under a different name, and contacted Rosie from a gas station payphone. "They're still covering it up," he told her when she answered. "Someone searched my room, warned me off the story." Rosie didn't sound surprised. "It happened to the doctor, too, and a reporter who came around in '92. They'll do more than search rooms if you keep pushing." "I need to go back to the ship," Lee said. "Get samples, more photos, actual evidence." "You're not listening," Rosie's voice sharpened. "This isn't just about a company that went bankrupt or some old contamination. Why do you think this has been kept quiet for so long? Who has that kind of power?" Lee thought about the records clerk mentioning national security, about the black SUV, about the caller who knew exactly what he was investigating. "I still need to go back," he insisted. "Will you help me? You know what I'm looking for better than I do." The silence stretched so long that Lee thought Rosie had hung up. "I never thought I'd go near that ship again," she finally said. "But maybe it's time someone finally exposed the truth. Not for me. I'm too old for it to matter much, but for the others who never got answers." They arranged to meet the next morning at a diner outside of town. Lee would bring his sampling equipment, and Rosie would bring something she said might prove even more valuable: her old employee ID badge. The security doors on the research levels had electronic locks, she explained. If they never bothered to change the system. Lee hung up the phone, a mixture of determination and unease settling in his stomach. He was no longer just documenting an unusual discovery. He was diving into something people with power wanted to keep hidden, a truth buried in the forest along with a massive ship that shouldn't exist.